about how you want to be introduced, and you sent me one line. So I expanded it. It's kind of from your own bio, so I apologize. So I'm very pleased to introduce my dear friend Kai Parker to give this talk today on storefront churches in the South Side of Chicago. Kai currently teaches Black religious history at the University of Virginia. He is originally from Harlem and got his PhD in history at the University of Chicago in 2019. His research focuses on Black Protestants in Chicago during the Great Migration, and he examines how messianic and apocalyptic strains of Black faith illuminate the tensions between conceptions of redemption and freedom in African American history.
The price of life these days, you've got to get everything.
He is working on finalizing his book project, Faith Without Hope, Black Protestants, Chicago and the Critique of Progress, 1914 to 1968, and it analyzes the way in which Black Protestants in Chicago express faith in spiritual redemption through their theological engagements with the municipal and global anti-Blackness. Chicago's Black Protestants indicated that the persistence of racial inequality and the emergence of the urban crisis revealed the limitations of the tendency to conceptualize the Black freedom struggle as a movement from slavery to freedom, analogous with the biblical Exodus. They're critiquing to life and worship services, gospel music, visual art, popular literature, non-normative conceptions of family and sexuality, and foreign mission organizing and political protest. So Kai is also thinking and writing and working on themes such as reparations, the influence of rural and apocalyptic worldviews on the formation of urban religious ways of being, and the theological valences of criminal justice reform and prison abolitionism, some of which stems from his work in involvement in PNAP here in Chicago and teaching in Statesville in Illinois. I've been particularly indebted to Kai and I's early conversations about freedom and movement and Exodus and stillness, sort of early in our careers together. And I think it's an incredibly generative thread to think together on, not just through your own historical sources that you're examining in Chicago, but just its contemporary relevancy of thinking about liberatory projects at this moment that don't hold on to things like hope and promise as the event. So we talked last night about Hong Kong and this sort of way of what are projects without that type of hope. So I'm just very pleased that you were here to share this with me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ray. You've been such a great friend, comrade, interlocutor, internet provider, and just been everything over the past several years. So thank you, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm really excited to be in this space, to see so many familiar faces, new faces, all kinds of faces. So gonna get started. This research is really just coming into formation. It's ongoing, and so this is a kind of early attempt to think through some of the stuff that I've been looking at in relation to integration, segregation, and racial transition and resegregation on the South Side in the 1960s primarily. And so the research takes place, so to speak, towards the end of the period that I'm looking at in my dissertation turned book project, so really dissertation. And so, yeah, hopefully I'll be able to express some of these ideas and we can talk about them and see where they may go. So my talk is called The Illusion of Integration, Storefront Churches and Racial Transition in the 1960s at the South Side. And the illusion of integration is my term for a phenomenon that's often overlooked in discussions of the history of racial segregation in Chicago and in other major cities. As hundreds of thousands of African American migrants moved from Chicago, from the deep South, from the rural South to Chicago in the mid-20th century, many neighborhoods began flipping from white to black. But there was often a transitional period in which these neighborhoods could appear to be integrated, particularly during the 1950s and the 1960s. And because the first Black people to move into the neighborhoods were often middle class, and because often the whites who delayed moving out of the neighborhoods were often more racially moderate or less racist, there could be a period where it seemed as if the neighborhoods had achieved a stable racial integration and had retained their commercial viability and the level of property value that they had had when they had been segregated whites-only neighborhoods. But in fact, these neighborhoods were not integrating, but rather were transitioning from white to black as history ended up showing pretty decisively by the end of the 20th century. However, the city of Chicago was able to use the fleeting illusion of integration to in some ways justify and in other ways ignore the processes by which the city powers were resegregating the city and reordering the city's political economy. And the city did this in part because biracial groups of middle-class progressives and liberals thought that they needed to subscribe to the illusion of integration in order to perpetuate their own existence, as well as to keep property values high in order to prove that integrated neighborhoods could remain socially and commercially viable and can contribute to maintaining the city as it was transitioning from an industrial to a post-industrial economy. So the neighborhoods could also be used to be celebrated as examples of the progress that had been achieved by the civil rights movement. And so particularly in cases that happened in the mid-1960s, late 1960s, often these were placed into a chronology of the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65, and now the achievement of middle-class integrated living in the late 60s. Thus, the illusion of integration brought many black and white progressive opponents of Mayor Richard J. Daley's segregationist government to Daley's side in the 1960s. Progressives in the Daley regime agreed that black storefront churches were a clear and present danger to a well-ordered city. Black storefront churches were thought to epitomize what was thought of as the social disorganization caused by black faith in the city. Storefront churches were, in a sense, attempts by black migrants to recreate and reinvent the kinds of small rural churches that had predominated in the South and that many had been familiar with. Unlike larger black churches in southern cities, these rural churches were often they often were not very much in debt. They often had very little relationship to any larger financial institutions. They didn't pay their pastors well. They often didn't even have regular pastors. Often they relied on a network of itinerant ministers. They often were not part of larger denominations, and even when they were, they often did not observe denominational authority. Oh, thanks. Thanks, John. They were constructed by voluntary labor and were often thought of as exemplars of black autonomy. However, the white power structure in the South largely left these churches alone because, in part, southern rural land was plentiful, and because the cotton economy was depreciating for a variety of reasons. These small rural churches were seen as good at enforcing the black agricultural labor discipline that was necessary to keep as much of the cotton economy going as could be in the early part of the 20th century. However, in the post-World War II period in the urban North, the churches were separated now from their connection to their ostensible connection to agricultural labor discipline. But they retained their nonconformity to the forms of financing and social organization that were thought of as to be kind of socially and economically viable. Furthermore, instead of occupying expansive tracts of land, tracts that were declining in value in the early 20th century, they were now packed into these dense, overcrowded urban areas, and areas that were thought of as, even if they weren't appreciating in value, areas that the city wanted to control through slum clearance policies, urban renewal, managing racial transition, and other sorts of policies. So because of this, the churches became much more of a threat to the order than they had been in the South. So storefronts represented black faith as black collectivity, autonomy, and nonconformity. And all these seem to be hostile to integration, to the illusion of integration, and to the idea of a well-ordered, integrated, and prosperous Chicago. And this was the case regardless of the church's own particular politics, beliefs, rituals, or practices. And so the case I want to focus on today is the case of St. James Temple of Apostolic Overcoming Holiness Church of God. And the case is an example of the illusion of integration, of how it manifested in 1960 Chicago. So the church was originally formed in 1945 at 30th and Michigan, in the heart of the classic older Bronzeville community. But it steadily located ever southward until in February 1965. It landed in Auburn Gresham at 856 West 79th Street. 2 blocks from a bustling commercial hub centered on 79th and Halsted. At the time, the church had 35 members, and so, like most storefront churches, it was small. And so, to kind of locate it geographically, I just want to show you a few images. So here is let's see. So okay, well here's 865 by 856 79. Now, as you can see, it's a vacant lot, and yeah, there's location. So it's basically on Peoria, about 2 blocks west of Halsted, and here. So you just get a sense of where it is in Chicago. So here's just a map showing a little bit sideways, but if you can kind of tilt your perspective here. Here you can see, this was just a map of racial segregation in Chicago in the 1940s, 1950s. And basically, and you can't see the names of the places of origin here, but basically this is comparing the spatial location of various ethnic groups in Chicago in 1940, and then compared to the spatial location of black people in Chicago in 1950, which is here. And so you can't really see it, but this is people from Germany, from Sweden, from the UK, from Mexico, from Puerto Rico, and then it says just Negro, which says a lot about the kind of lack of narrative location in space and time of black people, even in this kind of representation. As you can see, all these groups are relatively dispersed throughout the city, and even Mexicans and Puerto Ricans are relatively dispersed, but Negro, basically all located in this opaque black line here, and the classic south side of Chicago, Bronzeville community, and then a few in the nascent west side and near north side. And then here we see the expansion of Black Chicago in 1950 in black, 1960 in this kind of darker gray, and then 1967. And St. James was basically about right here. So right, if you can see right here, so you can see how the area is changing. It's in racial transition, and it's on the outskirts of the rapidly expanding Black Chicago of the 1960s. And here, this is the map of the 10 poorest communities in 1966 in Chicago from the Daily News. And here you can get a sense of some of the political, economic, and spatiality of Black Chicago at this time. As you can see, here you have Altgeld is number 1, and then you have the kind of classic old Bronzeville wards here. And then you have the West Side, which is interesting because most people often think of the Black West Side in the 60s was poorer than the classic South Side. And here, as you notice, there's Woodlawn is number 9, but the areas that are expanding in racial transition are not on the map, and so that gives you a sense of just the fact that these areas were more middle class, and that integration, the spread south, was being led by the Black middle class. And hopefully that's just helpful in terms of providing some spatial context here.
Excuse me.
Yes?
I want to know, what did you say about Woodlawn? Because I'm from Woodlawn.
Oh yeah, sure. So Woodlawn is kind of an in-between neighborhood at this time, I guess you could say. I mean, it has basically transitioned at this point very rapidly from white to black in about 10 years, basically. And it kind of, it's kind of like an interstitial space, basically, between the classic wards and, of course, Hyde Park here, and then the neighborhoods like Auburn Gresham, Chatham, Grand Crossing, that are integrating or transitioning rather here. So does that clarify?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Great. Yeah.